A century of floods and cattle grazing has changed the look of the place, which the flood erosion of 1908 had exposed as an ancient box canyon. The topography is now a grassy, shallow drain called Wild Horse Arroyo, and as we crowd around its edges, it seems somehow too commonplace to be the scene of one of the continent's most significant historical finds. Nonetheless, this in the flesh is the legendary Folsom archaeological site. It's the place where the world found irrefutable proof that we humans had been intimately involved with American wild animals that long ago went extinct. What McJunkin had done about where we now stood talking was to spot in the flood-gashed arroyo bones of an immense size he had never seen before. The exposed skeletal materials turned out to be from a herd of bison antiquus, an extinct form of giant bison. But the bones themselves weren't the pièce de résistance. At the time, the sciences of ethnology and archaeology in the United States were firm that American Indians had arrived in North America only a couple thousand years prior to the coming of Europeans. In the Old World, artifact hunters at France's La Madeleine rock shelter in 1864 had found a piece of ivory with a representation of a mammoth on it. That seemed certain evidence that in Europe, humans once coexisted with extinct Pleistocene animals. As early as the 1870s, popular magazines in Europe were carrying illustrations of humans doing heroic battle against monsters like cave bears and mammoths. That such sites hadn't turned up in the United States fed into a bias going back to a famous debate in the late 1700s between the French naturalist Comte de Buffon and Thomas Jefferson about whether America really was marginal to the global biological and human story. History has taken Jefferson's side in their argument, but Buffon turned out to be right about one aspect. In contrast to Jefferson, who thought extinction impossible, the French naturalist convinced the world that the strange creatures quarrymen were unearthing in Europe and America were species that had once roamed Earth, but were now long vanished. Buffon likewise annoyed Jefferson by casting aspersions on American Indians' assumed lack of a significant history compared to that of Europe. In 1908, the flood that swept away Sally Rooke and George McJunkin's discovery in the wake of it were about to change forever the narrative that America was marginal to humanity's deep story. Since Jefferson's time, scientists and ordinary citizens had been looking for something to refute Old World snobbery about America's past. In the wake of the La Madeleine discovery in France, the Smithsonian had mailed a circular asking military officers, missionaries, and Indian agents to be on the lookout for ancient fossil sites that might also show human antiquity. The stakes for demonstrating a deep human past in America were huge, and over time amateurs and scientists of various stripes advocated for at least 24 sites, from Florida to New Jersey, from Idaho to California, as possible evidence humans had been in America in the Pleistocene. They thought they'd found it in 1882, when footprints embedded in stone at the Nevada State Prison seemed to show mammoth tracks overlapping human prints. That led to an excited New York Times headline, "Footprints of Monster Men." Famous paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope thought the account convincing, but when University of California geologist Joseph LeConte went to investigate, he concluded that the Monster Man tracks were in fact those of a giant ground sloth. A classic late summer thunderstorm was brewing up over Johnson Mesa, as David Eck was explaining to us that until his death in 1922, George McJunkin proselytized about his find to anyone who would listen. 4 years later, in 1926, the black cowboy's plea to have a scientist look at his bone pit finally reached Jesse Figgins, director of the Colorado Museum of Natural History in Denver. Something of an amateur at this game, Figgins was mostly interested in fossil bison that might make exhibits in his museum. His team began an excavation of the site in May of 1926, and quickly began finding the skeletal remains of bison of an enormous size. That was exciting enough, but in their second season of work, on August 29, 1927, Figgins's crew troweled up big history pay dirt. As David Eck was gesturing to the dimensions of this near-century-old